Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Henry Pearson. I work here in the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. Hello to everybody joining us in Zoom, but of course, we're also streaming live on Facebook. So hello to everyone on Facebook as well. If this is your first OECD Education and Skills webinar, a big welcome, and welcome back to those who have watched us before. So today we're going to be looking at whether socioeconomic status plays a role in students' ability to cope with challenging situations and their ability to continue learning on their own without direct guidance or supervision from teachers. Obviously, the most obvious case of that recently has been school closures during the pandemic. So it is with that backdrop that we're going to be looking at this topic today. And specifically, actually, we'll be using data from the Programme for International Student Assessment, otherwise known as PISA. And we're going to take a look at whether there are any clues in that data that might shed light on the differences in COVID-19 learning losses between different groups of students based on that metric of how well they cope with challenging situations. We actually released a little online booklet about this topic as part of our PISA in Focus series, which is basically a series of small kind of brochures or online booklets that delve deeper into PISA data for different topics. So to take a look at this, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andrea Schleicher, OECD Director for Education and Skills. And also on the line is Miyako Ikeda, who is a senior analyst here in the directorate that works on PISA. Andreas is going to present for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time to take your questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And if you're on Facebook, put it in the comments box, and I will read out as many as I can to Andreas. We get a lot of questions. We don't always have time to read them all out, but we always take a look at what people are saying and asking in the chat. So please do go ahead and put your question in there. So Andreas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Henry, and welcome to everyone. We've all seen how this pandemic in different ways has amplified and accelerated the many inequalities inherent in education. And of course, the mechanisms behind that are often difficult to discern, but my colleague Miyako Ikeda and her team have done some really interesting analysis looking into what is it that makes social background disadvantage interrelate with learning opportunities, particularly in a situation like a pandemic where students just need to do a lot more learning on their own. But before getting into this, let's just start with the big picture. If you look at OECD data, you can see that this pandemic has heavily disrupted education systems. You look here at the number of instruction days lost at the upper secondary level, and you can see some countries in last year in 2020, like Denmark, Germany, New Zealand, got through this quite well. There was still, we're talking about at least months less lost, but then you look to Colombia and Costa Rica, where almost the entire school year was compromised. And it's not so much an issue of infection rates. Now, when you factor this in, you can see actually the rate of infection alone doesn't explain that loss of learning opportunity, that loss of instruction days. A better predictor actually is the quality of learning outcomes, the preparedness of education systems. Now, when you look at the PISA scores on the horizontal axis, at the number of days lost on the vertical axis, you can suddenly see the dots line up pretty well. In education systems that are doing well in terms of delivering good learning outcomes, school closures were limited. In education systems that are not doing well, where the students did not do well before the pandemic, a lot of learning time was lost. And that relationship doesn't change that much when you account for social background. So in a nutshell, you can see here how across countries, the pandemic has amplified the disparities across education systems. Now, high-performing education systems losing less, poor-performing education systems losing more, and therefore falling further behind. That's that kind of relationship at the cross-national level. And then, of course, within countries, the mechanisms were not very different. You can see that students who had learned to learn on their own, who had access to great technology, a very supportive ecosystem around them, parents and teachers included, they could continue learning during school closures, whereas students that used to be spoon-fed by the teachers, that did not have access to alternative learning opportunities, maybe not the right support from parents and teachers, they were the ones that were left behind. And you can imagine how social background then also within countries amplified the disparities. Of course, governments try to do a lot to mediate this. You can see that virtually all countries deployed some form of online learning platforms. Here you can see basically the number of countries that we surveyed, and you can see the bars are close to 100%, except the primary education, where obviously online learning is a bit more difficult. But basically, countries have tried to make sure that there is some lifeline for learning. Sometimes, take-home packages were used in regions where digital access was a problem. Television played a big role. Many teachers became movie stars. Basically, television was a great way to broadcast effective kind of learning practices, sometimes combined with mobile phones for the interactive components, radio, other distance learning modalities. So I just want to say that actually education systems have tried to provide alternatives when schools were closed. We don't have yet good data on how effective those alternatives have been, but certainly there was a lot of provision available. We've also collected data showing that actually there were a lot of efforts made to address learning gaps when schools reopened. Now, the time that was lost, trying a way to recuperate the cognitive, social, emotional learners. You can see, for example, here, over 70% of the countries used remedial measures to reduce student learning gaps. That could have been, instructions in the vacation periods, weekend lessons, additional time in school, just, adding to the volume of learning opportunities. The assessment of learning gaps has played a big role. Now, you can only remediate when you have figured out where learning gaps have occurred. So you can see also here lots of efforts went into this. Remedial measures with a special focus on disadvantaged students. Now, that's again an equity-related component for the reasons I explained. Disadvantaged students have lost out most, and there were actually in many countries efforts to give them, for example, first access when schools reopened, when places were limited, or when there was alternative learning. Sort of then disadvantaged students in some cases were given privileged access. Things like this happen. Also, remedial measures, special focus on students at risk of dropout or grade repetition, students who had fallen behind before the pandemic. Efforts are made to ensure that they do not end up repeating a grade or dropping out. So these are just a selection of the measures that many countries put in place. More than half of the countries put in place to help make up for learning losses when schools began to reopen. So again, I want to sort of highlight here some of the efforts that have been made. Targeting populations that had difficulties accessing, the digital learning opportunities. That's been a big struggle for many countries. But also here, you can see in over 8 out of 9 countries, there was some effort made to subsidize devices for access, basically handing laptops to students, to teachers for those who didn't have them. Some countries were very creative with this, like, and obviously new procurement efforts, normal procurement efforts were far too slow. So countries had to be very creative to mobilize existing technology, sometimes from the private sector, to get it into the hands of students. But there's been actually a lot of really interesting lessons, how this can be done quickly and effectively. And, countries like the Netherlands are a great example of how you can actually, ensure in a crisis that students have physical access to computers. There's also been a great jump in the development of learning platforms, both synchronous learning, where teachers gave lessons by Zoom or Teams and so on, but also asynchronous platforms where students could learn at their own pace. Again, you can see here in almost 8 out of 10 cases, those things were done in the OECD area. Improved access to infrastructures for learners in remote areas. That obviously was much harder to resolve. Sometimes bandwidth and connection were just too poor in some areas, and that's been in sort of one of the kind of challenges. And we see also here that's not always been successful, but efforts have been made. Again, supporting learners with disabilities. This is an area where technology is some of its most superior capacities. And technology is just so much better to understand and interact with disabilities and what we can do in a kind of one-size-fits-all classroom environment. That's been basically also improved access to infrastructure for learners in urban high-density areas, and sort of areas with kind of poor facilities. Some countries did some really interesting collaborative ventures with the mobile companies to offer students, for example, free access to education resources on their mobile phone, and so on. So you can see again, this has been on the radar screen of education systems, and many education systems tried to work on this. Now, once again, how successful this has been is not something that we can see at this point. I want to make a last point that's also quite important, and that is that when students learn at home, often parents become the educators, and they have not been as well prepared as teachers for that. And many parents actually went into an entirely new kind of role with this. But you can see also here that countries have done a lot to encourage better integration of parents with schools. Now, for example, communication on e-school platforms for teachers, students, and parents to make just sure that communication channels are well established. In normal times, communication between parents and school is often focused on isolated problems. Here, you needed this suddenly very quickly for all parents in all situations. Now, phone calls to students or parents to ensure that students follow up on their learning activities. That is particularly important, for students who have not been so much used to learn on their own, that parents can, a little bit, monitor what's happening and be reminded. Emails to students and parents, again, you can see we are close to sort of 90% on that still. Holding regular conversations about student progress or consulting parents to inform decision making. Now that's very important, again, that schools suddenly gave parents better instructional resources, better support with how to use them. And maybe you can ask yourself why we needed a pandemic for this. Now, these are things that probably should happen always, but they typically fall by the wayside because people understand the importance, but there's just no time. But in this pandemic, you could see lots of things were done, also creative use of software, of applications. But I think that integration of parents into the educational path has been a really important effort last year in many education systems. So, as a, basically just to prepare for what I'm going to talk about now, there has been a lot of effort to facilitate self-directed learning during the pandemic, and providing students with access to technology, with good infrastructure, with resources, with the kind of mentoring, and so on. But still, what we have seen, and I'm showing you data from the United States here from the use of a mathematics online platform, a very popular platform. You can see before the pandemic that use of that platform was quite consistent across social groups. Now, the light blue line here represents the top income quartile, the light green, the bottom income quartile, and then the dark blue, the middle one. So you can see basically across income groups, the pattern has been pretty stable before the pandemic. The ups and downs here simply are, the nature of the program, and students had to use it. But then, in March, in the United States, the pandemic hit, and you can see those lines very steeply went down. But you can already see here the lines for the students from wealthy background went down much less than the lines for students from poor backgrounds. But what's also interesting is that in the weeks after, those from wealthy backgrounds sort of recovered pretty much to the pre-crisis level. But those from poor backgrounds basically remained stuck. And again, here, this is not about the access to devices. Now, the access to devices was guaranteed. This is this kind of school-based program. Here, this is about the use of devices. So there was something that made students from disadvantaged backgrounds less active in the use of these platforms, whereas parents, as students from wealthy families, very quickly figured out what to do and then, bounce back. And that's really, I think, a very important context, because a lot of this technology debate focuses on devices and technology and access and broadband. And yes, those are important, but they do not explain what you're seeing here. And in order to explain that gap, we dug deeper in our PISA results and looked at, what are the attributes of learning? How does social background interrelate with the disposition of young people towards learning? And that's what I'm going to present to you in the following. So this is some new analysis on this. First question we ask ourselves is actually, how well are young people prepared to learn on their own? And we look at student self-efficacy. That's basically about, how much confidence they have in their own abilities to do things. We looked at their learning goals and we looked at their motivation. And you can see, for example, on self-efficacy, over 80% of 15-year-olds, that's our target population in PISA, said, when I'm in a difficult situation, I can usually find out my way of it. And you can see over 70% still say, my belief in myself gets me through tough times. And this is pre-crisis. These data were collected in 2018. So you can see actually a good share of young people are actually quite resilient. They have a high degree of self-efficacy, the will to actually, move through difficult moments, which is good. That's what you want in this moment of crisis. Now, when there is a crisis, students, who say basically, look, I'm going to cope with this. I'm going to get through this. Let's have a look at learning goals. You can see also here, 8 out of 10 15-year-olds say, my goal is to learn as much as possible. And these are 15-year-olds. Remember, sometimes they're not the most, interested ones in school. But also you have, almost 80% saying, my goal is to completely master the material presented in my classes. And that idea of mastery is so important. We know that learning is not just consuming material, but it's really about, having deep conceptual understanding of a topic to master it so that you can apply that knowledge in other areas. And you can see that intention, to set learning goals, to, really, invest yourself, to master the material is quite well established. At least, that's what young people, 15-year-olds report. And then motivation, also there, you can see close to 80% say, I find satisfaction in working as hard as I can. And once I start a task, I persist until it's finished, still over 70%. So the overall picture looks good. When you look at this, you think, wow, if there is a pandemic, those kids are going to, invest themselves, learn on their own, use online resources, and struggle through every possible difficulty until they succeed. That's the impression that you get. But the question is not the average student. The question here is, how will this affect students from different income quartiles or from different social backgrounds? So the good thing is that we collect those data for PISA. It's all, again, pre-crisis data, 2018, but we knew the social background of every student. We knew the parental education, the parental occupation, and by implication, the income levels. We knew the educational resources they had at home. We knew some of their cultural activities. So actually, we have a fairly good picture of the student social background. And we can aggregate all of that social background information and then look at, how does this impact on a student's readiness to learn. When I look at self-efficacy, you can see, and in this, I should explain the scale that you can see here. These are basically indices that summarize that sense of self-efficacy that I've just shown you. And basically, it goes with a standard deviation of of 1. So you can see here basically social differences. Now, when you look at the difference between advantaged and disadvantages, are very large. They're statistically significant in virtually all countries, and they're not just, statistically visible, but they're really, really substantially large. When you see here 0.5 on a scale with a standard deviation of 1. You can see particularly in Finland, in Korea, in the Chinese regions for which we have data, and so on. You can see these are very large numbers. So the self-efficacy that is such an important ingredient of self-directed learning suddenly becomes an artifact of social background. Students from wealthier background being much more ready to do that. And you can see the same picture with motivation. That's the yellow bubble here. Actually, if you would sort it like the blue bars, it would look very similar. So also the motivation to master complex tasks is very much a function of social background. And then last but not least, you can see that in most countries also with regard to the willingness of students to establish and pursue difficult learning goals. So in a nutshell, this is a very plausible explanation for what we've seen in the pandemic, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds actually did not have access to those learning strategies that make you persist, that make you resilient, that make you struggle when things get difficult, and that make you want to master the educational content. Whereas students from wealthy background bring those kinds of attributes with them. So here you can see we are now starting to understand some of the drivers and how they play out in different countries. What's also interesting, though, is that this kind of social gap varies across countries. It's not that this is sort of a function, something that happens everywhere for every student in exactly the same way. No, you can see on the left side, countries where that relationship is particularly strong, and countries on the right side where that relationship is just moderately strong, or in some cases actually barely measurable, like here on the right side. But overall, I think you can conclude from this that actually the readiness of students to learn is very much impacted by social background. So you can give young people the best possible technology. If you cannot, equip them and support them in their learning process to compensate for, weaknesses in approaches to learning, that's what you're going to see. That technology will not leverage this. The same is true for parental support. I just showed you how much effort schools make to reach out to parents during the pandemic, to bring them on board, to create that environment. But you can also see here that when you look at the parents' emotional support that students perceive, you can see also that it's very much a function of the self-efficacy, or the self-efficacy very much a function of that, their motivation and the learning goals is this. Same kind of pattern that basically where you as a parent, you as a student perceive, my parents are going to support me, then, it drives those kinds of readiness to learn outcomes. But unfortunately for students from poorer backgrounds, that perception is often a lot weaker. So same pattern, same picture. You can argue that, parents can, of course, make up for school closures to some extent, but what you can see here is in the eyes of students, often that is less pronounced among the more disadvantaged parents. So once again, social background becomes an amplifier of the parental effect. And then last but not least, of course, how does readiness to learn affect the outcomes? That's, of course, the question we all want to know, to what extent those kinds of dispositional attitude factors influence outcomes. And unfortunately, those effects are very, very big. You can see here the score points on the PISA reading tests. And remember, when you talk about 25, 30 points, that's, almost what students learn in a school year. So this is a very large difference. And you can see again for self-efficacy, social background. And actually, this is now after accounting for student social background, basically the pure effect of self-efficacy after you control for social differences. is, in a very significant kind of amount. And then motivation to master tasks, you can see that even more clearly. And then the establishment of learning goals as well. So once again, students who report greater readiness to learn do better on the outcome metrics. And it is usually students from socioeconomically privileged backgrounds who are more likely to be ready to learn on any of the dimensions that we have measured. That's really all I wanted to show you. So I think it gives you a little better understanding of what are some of the drivers that actually could explain why students from disadvantaged backgrounds, even if they had access to technologies to compensate for learning gaps, have not sometimes benefited from this as much as students from wealthy backgrounds. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. So we've got time for some questions. Quick reminder to everybody that you can use the chat in Zoom for your questions or the comments box in Facebook. So we have a question here already from Fatima, who says, what are your recommendations for schools and teachers to improve student readiness to learn, regardless of socioeconomic backgrounds? And are there any good examples in the world from a country that you think stands out?
Well, regarding good examples, you could see some countries that have, higher values on this indices. There must be something going on in this countries that support students better. We have not been able to distill that yet. At least I'm not aware of this. My colleague Miyako might have some information. But what schools can do, I think I have two answers to this. First of all, I think this crisis has highlighted how important students' readiness to learn really is for students, and not just in a moment of crisis. The capacity of students to learn on their own, to have that drive, that motivation, that self-efficacy, that readiness, is something that we are going to value throughout our lives. People become lifelong learners. It will not just depend on what they know, but also on that capacity to learn, to have access to the right learning strategies and the motivation. So I do believe that schools just need to pay greater attention to this as an important outcome of learning, and to ensure that students from all social background really invest in this. Probably schools have been sensitized to minimizing social differences in learning outcomes like math and science, but this is probably an area that we have not paid so much explicit attention to. And my really main takeaway from this is that teachers and schools probably should redouble the investment in fostering strong learning strategies. And once again, if your students, sit unmotivated in front of the classroom and just consume a lesson, that's probably not a way to foster this. It's probably the more active learning strategies, the more agency driven kind of approaches to learning that are going to do best to foster that intrinsic motivation. But I wonder, whether Miyako has some things to offer on the first part.
There's Miyako.
Yes, I think the first part is something that we need to wait and see what comes out, because now it's still that now in the middle of the pandemic. But I have something to add for the second part. That PISA, for the first time, we measured the growth mindset. Also, the fear of failure we measured. For this PISA in Focus policy brief, we focused on the 3 indicators: self-efficacy and learning goals and motivation to master tasks because of the space issue. But these are also related to growth mindset and fear of failure. So as Andreas said, that the educators and the schools that it's important to to focus on the holistic development of the children, and to find a way to not give too much the fear of failure, because we saw that all these 5 indicators are highly correlated. Those kids who have high self-efficacy, they tend to have less fear of failure. So in this COVID situation, I think there are so many new things in our certain situation, and then often people fail for the first time. But what is important is do not have the fear of failure and try again and find a way to overcome the challenges. So that it's important to approach children for the holistic way in the many different aspects to make sure that students do not have unnecessary fear of failure. And then children should be able to believe their ability to overcome any setbacks.
Thanks, Miyako. It seems in the chat, Raquel and Nicholas tend to agree. They're both pointing out the importance of self-efficacy, motivation, and Raquel was talking about self-regulation. A lot of these skills, Andreas, seem related to social and emotional skills. I wonder if you could talk more about that. Are these things that schools can teach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also social emotional skills are not, traits or personality traits. They are skills that we can teach, sometimes better at younger ages than at older ages and so on. But I do think we need to, conceptualize them as things that education should focus on and that we can provide learning environments for to develop. I really believe, if you give students, little bits and pieces of problems to solve, they're not going to learn to be persistent. They learn to be persistent when they actually, have tough, complex problems to solve and receive good support from their educators and their parents to work through them. So I think that we can structure learning environments certainly in a way that they are not just leading to better cognitive outcomes, but also better social and emotional outcomes. And actually, our recent survey on social emotional skills showed how predictive stronger social emotional skills are also for better grades at school. So actually, I think we shouldn't look at cognitive outcomes and social emotional skills as two ends on a spectrum, but really as two sides of the same coin.
In fact, Raquel, in the same question, she was the one that brought up self-regulation. She had a second part to the question, which was how can tech help us in this regard, and how can it help us collect big data to personalize the curriculum?
I think that's a very good question. Obviously, in this pandemic, we have seen that if motivation matters in a traditional setting, it matters even more in an online setting. If you get bored in a lesson with a teacher, probably you're most at risk actually of losing out on a digital environment. But actually, technology can offer many solutions here. First of all, I think we can deal with motivation in a more nuanced way. For example, the cognitive, the behavioral, the attitudinal components. And some technology solutions use sensors to actually capture those elements. There's actually really interesting learning software out that actually finds out when students get bored or when they get distracted or when they make erratic responses and then re-engages them. That's not possible in a classroom setting with 30 kids in a class. So I think yes, technology can make learning more engaging for students. It can also, why should you listen to a teacher explaining you the result of a science experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? So again, also there, technology can make learning more engaging. But there's also, and I think that was also part of the question, is one thing more that technology can do, and that is make learning so much more granular, so much more adaptive, so much more interactive. None of us learns like this in a linear way. We always learn suddenly we understand something, and then we have another of these aha moments. And technology can figure out when those moments occur and then adapt learning at the task level, at the curriculum level. There's great potential, but actually, that is the promise of technology. So far, we have seen relatively little of this. And certainly in the pandemic, most technology was used to sort of just conserve existing practice. Teachers giving lesson by Zooms, not to really transform learning practice to make learning more engaging and more interactive through technology. And so I think there's a long way to go for technology to fulfill that promise, but I certainly see very significant potential for technology to make the learning process more equitable, to get away from the kind of one-size-fits-all philosophy of instruction, to really devise the right curriculum for every student.
Thanks, Andreas. In the chat here, Rodolfo has pointed out that COVID is not the only crisis that students today are going to face, climate change being an obvious one. A question would be then, were the challenges faced unique to a crisis like COVID, or would strengthening disadvantaged students' skills in these areas help them deal with future disruptions like climate change, for example?
Yeah, that's actually our main reason for focusing so much on this. Yes, COVID has been disruptive, but the future will always surprise us. And, young people these days, every day you wake up in a different world. In the past, you could learn once for your lifetime. Things actually were difficult, but quite stable and quite predictable. In school, you could figure out, what job you want to get into, you learn for it, you get it, and you stay there. Today, your job, of dreams may no longer exist when you graduate, or if it exists, it may disappear. Robots may come in, all sorts of things will happen. And therefore, I think the capacity of people to continue to learn, but also to unlearn and relearn when the context changes, is going to become increasingly crucial. And that capacity will be very much driven by, things like motivation, intrinsic motivation. Is that something, that is important to me? Do I develop a passion for this? Do I have access to the right strategies to address a problem? No? Anxiety comes often, from not having access to the right support and the right strategy. So we believe that that kind of cognitive, social, and emotional resilience is going to be a key ingredient for being successful in tomorrow's world. So that's why we put so much attention to this, not because of the COVID pandemic.
I've just seen in the chat, Raquel's responded and told us that she's in Brazil. And apparently in Brazil, this generation that have dealt with COVID disruptions in school have been branded a lost generation. What's your reaction to that kind of attitude towards this cohort of students?
Well, I think what is very difficult to tell now is it's probably easy to see what people have lost. Now, I think we can see in tests, what the learning gaps are by different social groups and so on. I think what's harder to discern is what has this generation learned that previous generation did not learn, particularly when it comes to becoming more resilient, to address, difficulties, to work through to learn on your own. Perhaps, previous Brazilian generations were very good at, absorbing content knowledge for a test. This generation had to manage more on their own. And I think that's going to be a question that we need to answer. To what extent, maybe this is the generation of students that has reinvented education. I think we should look at this as not just the losses, but we should look also at the gain. And certainly, I think this generation has gone through a process that subsequent generations will increasingly see now.
And what about the role of the teacher? So I remind everybody that tomorrow is the 5th of October, and the 5th of October is International Teachers' Day. So could you talk a bit more about the role of teachers in kind of closing these gaps for learning losses and also for disadvantaged students?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of short-term answer to this and a longer-term answer. In the short term, it is crucial that teachers, redouble their efforts to provide additional learning opportunities for students, and that's fortunately happening in many countries. I think that's one of the things that, at least in the OECD world, we see many efforts to this extent. But that's the immediate. In the longer term, I think it puts in question our pedagogical models. Typically we would think a great teacher is one who has a real passion for the subject and who understands how different students learn that subject. So someone who's good on the content and good on the pedagogy. I think what you've seen in the crisis is actually that there's a third component, and that is whether teachers really know their students and actually can engage with them in different ways. And I think, that's probably what students will remember from this crisis. Who were the teachers who, looked after me, who looked out for me, who understood, my dreams, my passions, who I am, who I want to become. And I think that's the area where probably in the future that will become more to the center. That on the content delivery, technologies probably play a big role. Probably, in the medium term, technology will become better than humans on the delivery of education content. I would think that's going to happen in a reasonably short term. But then, that human and social role of teachers to be a great mentor, to be a good facilitator, a good coach, a good evaluator, that's going to become ever more crucial for teachers to accompany people in their learning pathways in very individual ways. And it's going to make the role of teachers probably also more interesting, more engaging, but certainly a lot more challenging. If you are, just good in broadcasting knowledge, you were out of business in this pandemic. People would just, switch off. You needed to be able to really reach out to your students to find out, who they are and engage with them. And I think that kind of relational function will become more important for teachers. Now, learning is not a transactional enterprise. Learning is always a social, relational kind of business.
Hamid in the chat has stayed on the topic of teachers and asks, how does teacher training need to change then to adapt to this new environment?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that teacher training can prepare people for, but I would actually say that we often overemphasize what you can do to prepare people for a job, and we underestimate, the environment in which people need to develop and adapt. So I think, giving teachers time for other things than teaching in school, giving teachers time for collaborative professional development, work with your colleagues, become a great designer for innovative learning environments. I think to have an environment, a work organization that is more conducive to adaptation, to evolution, to growing in your own profession, is probably a lot more important in this aspect of teacher training. And I think that's true for every job. And when it comes to other jobs, we are realizing this. When it comes to teachers, we often say, let's train them a little bit more. I don't think that's really the issue. The issue is more about, what organization and environment do we offer people to have the time? If you go from one lesson to the next and have to teach a lot of material, you do not have that time for reflection. I sometimes admire education systems in countries where actually teachers spend a lot of time with their students outside formal classroom settings. They do clubs, they do activities with students, and it's that. But probably in the future will prepare the ground for this. Or where teachers do lesson study, they try out different methods, they evaluate their effectiveness. I think that for me is the more crucial part than the teacher training issue. But I know that it's still an important area.
I'm aware that I've unfortunately been ignoring our friends on Facebook, and we have a question from Facebook from Megal, and it's more about PISA itself. So Megal asks, what questions are currently occupying PISA researchers with respect to technology, student learning, and the will of governments? How do we ensure the pandemic experience is not wasted?
Yeah, I think Miyako is the best place to work on this. Actually, she is working on this topic right as we speak on a global crisis module. Miyako, maybe you can talk about this.
Yes, for the next assessment of PISA will be happening in 2022, next year. And we included a new module called Global Crisis Module, Andreas just talked about. And this is about what kind of learning happened during the school closure. So we asked the students their experience related to school, how the teacher contacted with them, how many assignments they get, and how often they got the contact from the teachers, what they did for learning during the school closure. So all this learning related activities during the school closure, we try to collect the data, and then this data will be available after the PISA main study. And also even before the pandemic, we were thinking about the focus of the PISA 22. And one of the many things that we worked on is ICT familiarity. So we prepared the framework for the ICT familiarity of the students, and we collected more granular data of the ICT use in the classroom for the students, and also that how those ICT devices are used for learning. And also there is an innovative domain, which is the creative thinking for PISA 22. So this is a very important area that we are now looking into for the next PISA survey.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, if you do have suggestions on what PISA should be looking at, write to us. I think we learn a lot from people in the field who have, ideas on what PISA should be about. PISA is always a community-built product.
Thanks, Andreas. So we have a question from Mahender, who points out that Mahender's afraid that e-learning, so learning on Zoom or something like that, makes people into introverts. So I wonder if you could comment on your views on kind of the remote version of learning versus the in-person version. Of course, during the pandemic, it was mostly remote. Is there a space for remote learning? Is it much worse than in-person learning? How do you see that balance?
Well, it's we have very little kind of evidence on this so far, but intuitively, I would say that it's very hard for remote learning to get anywhere close to what you can experience in a kind of personal context with a teacher. That being said, I wouldn't say this introversion, extroversion is just not so clear. Many traditional lessons are not giving students many opportunities to express themselves. Students sit behind a chair and then you listen to what the teachers say. That's probably a lot worse than remote learning, where you can sort of reflect, where you can interact, where you can pause, where you can learn at your own pace. So I think the question is more, how do we use the in-person context more deliberately to focus on the social and emotional skills? How do we basically, get the transactional parts out of the classroom for our students to work on individually? If you just have to listen to educational content, you can do that well supported with great technology. But let's use the social spaces in school much more deliberately to actually foster that interaction, that kind of social and emotional development that is so much valued. So that would be my point. I don't think we should take it for granted that personal learning does it a lot better. Actually, some does. Some teachers are very good at it, and some not. And I think so far we lumped it all into a classroom. And in the future, we should look at more deliberately of what we do best in the social situation and where technology can actually either substitute or complement it. Technology can also make learning more interactive. Actually, you can reach out, you can bring in views and expertise from the outside the world. You can Zoom can be just a substitute for the traditional lesson. The teacher teaches you on Zoom, but Zoom can also bring the expertise of the world into the classroom. You suddenly can talk to scientists. You can talk to people on the street. School can be a much more open environment. So I really think that's the challenge in front of us. How can we reconfigure the people, the space, the time, and the technology so that learning occurs best?
Thanks, Andreas. It looks like we don't have any more questions that don't touch on things we've already covered. So with that, maybe I can bring us to a close. So thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Miyako, and thanks to everybody for watching. And if you'd like to learn more about PISA and the PISA in Focus series, you can find it on our website. I believe my colleague Jason put the link to that brochure I mentioned in the chat. But if you'd like to keep up to date with everything we're doing in general, I would encourage you to go and have a look at our Twitter page, which is @OECD Edu Skills. That's where we put all the most up-to-date things that we've been working on. And it's really the best place to find our material, and you'll find links there to the website too. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you can make the next webinar.